welcome back to my channel, Beautiful Minutia. If you're new here, my name is Tiffany, and today I wanted to share with you all of the books that I read in February. I feel like I read a lot more in February than I did in January. However, I actually have less books to show for it, which is fine. I am still working my way through War and Peace. I am now over 700 pages through, which is a lot. I can't remember where I was when I stopped in January, but I'm pretty sure it wasn't more than like 300 pages. So that's a lot of War and Peace that I read in February. And then I also started The Mysteries of Udolpho and got a couple hundred pages into that. I think around 200 pages. And so those books are carrying over into March, which if you've seen my March TBR, you already know that. But those are books that I read a lot of pages in but didn't complete. So they're not technically in this wrap up, even though I just mentioned them. So they are in this wrap up, but I'm not giving final ratings or final thoughts or anything like that. Also, my kittens are playing. And so if you hear a bell in the background or thumping, they are running around being crazy right now. But sometimes you just gotta film when you gotta film. So to wrap up my month, I did complete 6 books and I DNF'd 1 and I have 2 that are still in progress. Out of those books, 2 were nonfiction, which I'm pretty pleased about because I'm not normally a huge nonfiction reader. 1 was a sci-fi, 1 was a romance. 1, I don't know how you categorize it. It might be a YA, it might be adult. It's got some sci-fi elements to it, so I don't really know how to categorize that one. I have 1 middle grade and then 1 that I think is YA, but it kind of is like, feels like a YA middle grade hybrid, if that makes sense. So I'm gonna go in order of my rankings this month. I think most of the books that I read are kind of like in the 3 to 4 star range. I actually didn't have any 5 stars this month, but I'm gonna go ahead and start with my DNF, which I no longer have a physical copy of because I already unhauled it. And that book is Austenland by Shannon, Hale. And I read this one during a reading vlog, so if you want, you can watch that and kind of get more in-depth thoughts. But basically, I had a lot of books that I was planning to read in February, and I just wasn't feeling it. I got half of the way through and just didn't like the main character, didn't really like kind of the way the plot was unfolding, although I did really like the setting itself of Austenland. It's about a woman who is kind of like in denial that she is obsessed with Jane Austen, to the fact where she even like hides her Pride and Prejudice DVD because she just doesn't want people to know how much she loves it. And she has a rich relative that dies and ends up leaving her a trip to this, I almost want to say theme park, but it's not really quite a theme park, where everything is Regency era and it's all patterned after Jane Austen. And she goes for like a 3-week trip there. And yeah, she just kind of sees it as like a last hurrah before she has to give up her hope of ever finding her Mr. Darcy. And it just, I don't know, it just wasn't for me. I'm not a huge fan of romance anyway, especially in like literary form. Like, I mean, it's one thing in a movie, like a rom-com is a little different for me than a romantic book, because a romantic book, you're very much in the characters' heads. And so sometimes that can be a little cringy. I really wasn't that much of a fan, but I can see why people really love it. I just felt like it wasn't for me, and I had all kinds of other books that I wanted to get to instead, so I ditched it. Okay, I guess the next one up, this is like 3.5 stars. That's Never Let Me Go by Kazua Ishiguro, which I'm probably pronouncing really wrongly. This book is really hard to describe because it really quickly gets into spoilery territory, and so I don't really know how much to say about it. It is a narrative of a woman who is now an adult, who is looking back at her childhood, but mostly teenage years, growing up in like this boarding school, and her relationship with like her 2 best friends. And that's pretty much the gist of the story that I can say without spoiling it. So first of all, I went into this book not even knowing what I just told you, because I had heard you should not know very much going into this book, so I didn't look for any information anywhere. But then I was trying to figure out how to categorize this book, and I didn't want to look on Goodreads because Goodreads sometimes has more information than I want to know. So I looked at the front of the book, like the part, I'll cover up what I'm talking about so I don't spoil you. This part that is the year it was published and all the publishing information, because they've got these little things down at the bottom of the page that kind of like tells you the categories they're in. And I thought it might say whether or not it was YA. It had like major spoilers in it as to like the subject matter of the book. And so I went into it, well, I guess I was probably like maybe a quarter of the way into it or less, and found some very major spoilers, which is unfortunate. I think maybe I would have liked this book a bit more if that hadn't been the case. But even so, this never would have been a 5-star read because the narrative style kind of drove me nuts a little bit. Because like I said, this woman is an adult now looking back on her life, and so she'll be like, so this one thing happened when I was like 15, and in order for this conversation to make sense that I already started telling you about, I need to go back like 3 weeks earlier to this other conversation. So I'm going to start to tell you about that. But actually, that's not going to make sense until I explain this thing that happened between me and this guy when we were like 8. And so now that I've explained that, now I can skip forward to this conversation and then the original conversation and then make my point. And that happens over and over and over again. And so that was kind of annoying, honestly, and not a very fun reading narrative style for me. Like, it just wasn't a great reading experience for me personally. Also, there's a lot of angst in this, but I do feel like it's somewhat tempered because the narrator is now an adult. So she can kind of see like, oh, well, we did this, but now I'm realizing like, that wasn't really a good thing. Maybe we shouldn't have felt this way. Maybe we shouldn't have acted this way towards each other and stuff. And so that made that part a little bit more bearable. This book does raise some very interesting moral questions, and it's very thought-provoking. So I really did like that about it, which is why I'm giving it 3.5 stars. But yeah, there were things I didn't like about it too. I should also mention, because I'm someone who tends to avoid a lot of sexual content in books, this book actually has a lot more sexual content than most books that I read. However, it's not super detailed. It's just really pervasive because we're dealing with teenagers, I think. But yeah, it's not explicit or detailed or smutty, but I just figured I would throw that in there in case you try to avoid that, because I know I have a lot of people who watch my videos who aren't comfortable reading that kind of thing. Okay, moving on into the 4-star territory. So I was very fortunate to be able to get an arc of a book. That was really exciting. So I got Son of the Deep. And this is the first book that is published by a new publishing house, Owl's Nest Publishing. So I was really excited. Katie from Life Between Words is one of the founders of this publishing house. And so I was really pumped to read this book. This is a gender-bent Little Mermaid retelling, which is really fun. So it's a merman and then a human girl. And I really liked this book for a lot of reasons. One of the things I liked the most about it is its dual perspective, although it's written in third person, but we do switch between Rose, who is the human girl, and Orfeo, who is the mermaid or merman boy. And I liked that a lot because when you get the original Little Mermaid fairy tale or even the Disney Little Mermaid, you don't hear anything about the prince really at all. You just basically get the Little Mermaid's perspective the entirety of the story. So I really liked that we were switching, and it made me feel a lot more connected to them. I also liked, Little Mermaid is kind of an insta-love story, so I don't really like that because it's a trope that I don't enjoy. And there are definitely elements of that here, but it's less so than the original fairy tale or than the Disney movie. So I really liked that a lot. There's definitely like some political things going on. If you know me, I am a big fan of politics in fantasy books, so I really liked that. However, there were some tropes in it that I didn't love, so it didn't end up being a 5-star. And I also think that my reading experience was less wonderful than it could have been. Since it was an ARC and I was like emailed a PDF, I had to read it on my phone. And I hate reading books on my phone because I just get like really distracted and want to check other things. As opposed to a physical book, I don't get as distracted by, but there's no getting around that. But there were some tropes in it that I just didn't love. And so I rated it a little lower because of that. And I can't even tell you what the tropes are because they're quite spoilery. But it did kind of like impact the ending for me. And I was just kind of like, oh. But it still had a satisfying ending to an extent. It just had some things in it that I just didn't love, and that's okay. It's still a wonderful book if you like fairy tale retellings, which I do. I am a sucker for a good fairy tale retelling, and this is a very good fairy tale retelling. And it kind of is on the cusp between middle grade and YA. It definitely traverses a little bit more into YA territory here and there, but I didn't feel like it was as angsty and frustrating as YA can be for me, and it definitely had like a whimsical childlike feel to it. So it feels like it's kind of in between those two genres. Okay, next up in the 4-star territory was Finding Langston by Lisa Klein Ransom. This is a book that I also read during that same reading vlog when I read Austenland. So I'm not gonna totally like rehash my thoughts on this, but it follows a boy who has moved from the South, I think it's Alabama. It's either Alabama or Mississippi, to Chicago during the Great Migration. And so that was like a really interesting setting and nothing I've really read before. And it's a great book that really examines like feeling displaced and grief of a parent and dealing with bullying. And then he encounters Langston Hughes' poetry. And so it's a really wonderful, it's a super short book. So I really liked this one. Next up in the 4-star territory was The Sun Does Shine by Anthony Ray Hinton. This was actually on my 5-star prediction list, so it was a little bit lower than I was hoping, but I still did really enjoy this book. I found it really inspiring. If you haven't heard of this book, it is the story of someone who is wrongfully convicted of murder and then put on death row, and he was completely innocent. And so then Brian Stevenson is a lawyer who represents him, and Brian Stevenson is the author of Just Mercy, which was one of my favorite books from last year. So I had really high hopes for this one because people told me I would like this even more than I liked Just Mercy, but unfortunately I didn't. I liked Just Mercy just a little bit more. For some reason, I just kind of had a difficult time connecting to the writing at certain points, and I don't know why. You know, I can't really put my finger on why, I guess. But I still really did enjoy it, particularly with him talking about like choosing to forgive because he didn't have a choice for most things because he was imprisoned and had to do everything that people made him do. And so but he could choose to forgive. He didn't have to remain like imprisoned in anger. And I just found that really inspiring, and it was a really, really good book, and I still very highly recommend it. Next up is my other nonfiction for the month, and that's Celebration of Discipline by Richard Foster. I'm not gonna keep holding this up because you can't even hardly see this. It didn't have a dust jacket. I bought it from Better World Books. It didn't have a dust jacket, and that's okay. So I read this book as a group read with Krista from Books and Jams. She hosted a read along for this, and we did live shows every Sunday, which was really, really wonderful and enjoyable. I always feel like I get more out of Christian nonfiction books when I'm reading them in a group and we can discuss what stood out to us. I always find I just enjoy it that much more, and it's that much more memorable to me. So this book is basically about, I think, 12 disciplines of the Christian life, and it has disciplines that are inward inside you that you work on, outward ones, and then corporate ones, which are ones that you would practice with other believers. I feel like this book was really practical. So he would explain the discipline, he would explain where you see it in scripture, and he quoted a lot of other really like well-known Christians. And then he would talk about ways to specifically implement them. And I thought it was very practical. I think I would give it probably closer to like 4.5 stars, but there were things in it that I just didn't agree with. And not that they're necessarily wrong, but I think that maybe they were kind of like a misinterpretation, or maybe not something that I necessarily agree with. And so I rated a little lower for that, but it's really difficult for me to find books that I like 100% align with, spiritually, and I am very picky about my nonfiction and tend to kind of like dissect it and really stack it up against the word. So for that reason, it was just a little bit lower, but I just really, really loved this book. My last book, I lied to you. I do have a 5-star read and I forgot about it. I don't know why. This is the first book I finished this month, so maybe that's why I forgot. Golden Sun by Pierce Brown. This is book 2 of the Red Rising trilogy. Well, the original trilogy. Now there's like 5 books. So anyways, this is book 1 or book 2. Gosh. And yeah, it was wonderful. Oh my goodness. So I can't really tell you very much about it without spoiling Red Rising. But it is a sci-fi, and it follows a very interesting class system that is color-based, which is something that I really, really love about it. I had some issues with the first book, and I actually did vlog when I was reading it, so I'll link that in case you want to watch it. But my biggest issue, I think, was the writing style. It's written first person present tense, which is just not my favorite, but I can usually get into it if I'm enjoying the book itself. But the writing style in Red Rising was super choppy to the point where it was like annoying, and it took me probably like halfway through the book to actually start really enjoying it and being able to let that part of it go. This book was not nearly so choppy, and I actually didn't have any issue with the prose at all getting into it. It really wasn't distracting, even the fact that it was in first person present tense. I loved the storyline so much that I just fell right back in. Oh my goodness, so much happens in this. It is a roller coaster. I cried when I read this book in one part, and then the ending was so shocking and so crazy and over the top. Like, oh my word, it was crazy. So I'm reading Morningstar with Dia, which I read this book with Dia also, and Red Rising. And yeah, I just like the whole month I was just waiting for me to be able to start Morningstar, but I was trying to be responsible and finish some of my other reads. But this was such a great book. Oh my goodness, I liked it so much better than the first book. Word of warning if you haven't started this series, it is quite dark and violent at times, and Golden Sun definitely ups the ante from Red Rising. So if you're not into that, maybe you won't enjoy it. And if you are not a huge sci-fi fan, you might still like this, because I kind of have a difficult time with sci-fi, but I loved this book and I love this series so far. And the sci-fi elements have not been prohibitive to me understanding or enjoying it. So yeah, I loved this book so much. I would love to talk more about it, but it would be very spoilery for book 1 for me to tell you like anything about this book at all. So it's great. So those are the books that I completed in February. Would love to hear from you in the comments down below, what you have been reading lately, maybe a favorite book that you read in February. Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, please hit like and also subscribe so you can continue to see more bookish content from me, and I will see you again next time.